Folks, you've already heard me. I introduced him last week. Brian Brown is a national leader on the issue of marriage, and it seems that every day the situation gets worse. You all probably heard today that the Attorney General is now urging state attorneys general not to defend laws or constitutional amendments that provide that marriage is a union between one man and one woman. He is giving them leave to say you don't have to defend those laws. In fact, he's even arguing you can oppose those laws. So every day it seems that there's some new attack coming forth. And this is a man who's clearly been working in the field a long time, I think about 10 years on this issue, maybe a little longer. And he's got a lot to say because I think, folks, that this is an issue we simply cannot lose. And right now, I'm in doubt as to which way this is going to go. So Brian, please take the floor and share with us, and we'll have some questions for you after you've finished.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Bishop Jackson. Thank you so much for your leadership and having this call. I'm going to briefly try to address, obviously, where we're at. And as you bring up, we're in a very difficult spot right now, given what's going on, especially in the courts, and then talk about four, I think, key action items. I think the most important thing to look at in the fight right now is to take seriously what Justice Scalia said in his dissent in the Windsor decision. As everyone on the call knows, the Windsor decision did away with a key section of the Defense of Marriage Act. And in the dissent, Justice Scalia essentially said that we need to make no mistake that this court will get away with what it thinks it can get away with. And so the path that we're on is that probably within a year to a year and a half, there will be a case before the Supreme Court on whether same-sex marriage is a quote-unquote constitutional right, whether the court will have a Roe v. Wade on marriage, forcing same-sex marriage on the entire country. And given what attorney generals are doing, Virginia is one, but in other states we've seen the same thing, most recently in Oregon, refusing to defend their laws, General Holder's comments basically encouraging this form of lawlessness. On one hand, you have a number of states that are simply refusing to defend their laws and in some cases actually throwing in with their opposition. However, there are states in which the attorney generals are vigorously defending their marriage laws. Utah is a key example. The reason that is important is because the sort of golden ticket to the Supreme Court is a circuit split, and that, I believe, will likely happen, and therefore that's why we end up at the court. What can we do in the meantime? Well, we need to make clear to the Supreme Court in any way we can that there is strong opposition to the redefinition of marriage. Both Justice Ginsburg and Justice Kennedy have made comments that have made clear that at least there is some understanding that the view that the court will settle this once and for all is untrue. Ginsburg has pointed back to the Roe v. Wade decision and said that did not settle the issue. Instead, it polarized American politics up until the present. So there is some reason for hope. Again, I don't want to wear rose-colored glasses here. We're in a difficult position, but there's one other factor that I think has not been adequately addressed. We all know that the media is largely against us. One of the things that they failed to really report on is the fact that in the Utah case, the lower courts refused to grant a stay in the challenge to Utah's constitutional amendment. In fact, Judge Shelby not only did not grant a stay, but immediately put into effect his decision. That's why you have 1,500 or so same-sex marriages occurring in Utah. The Attorney General then went to the 10th Circuit. The 10th Circuit refused to grant a stay, again, basically overturning the overwhelming vote of the citizens of Utah. But when an emergency appeal was issued to the United States Supreme Court, And the way this works is there's one justice from the Supreme Court assigned to different circuits. The justice assigned here in the 10th Circuit was Sotomayor. She referred that question of whether a stay should be granted to the entire court. And the entire court said, yes, a stay will be granted. There will not be same-sex marriages continuing to occur in Utah, pending higher court resolution. Why is that so important? It's important because one of the procedural reasons why a higher court would grant a stay needs to be that there's some likelihood that the underlying decision, in this case a bad decision, creating same-sex marriage in Utah, would be overturned by a higher court. Well, who's the higher court? The higher court is the Supreme Court itself. So, again, it doesn't mean for certain this will happen, but it gives us some hope. So what are the things that we can do? Well, again, number one, we discussed that we are going to have we're working with a number of different partners to have a major public display of support for traditional marriage in our nation's capital at the March for Marriage on June 19th. We want tens of thousands of people, as many as we could get together to highlight to the court that there is still strong support for traditional marriage in this country. So number one, getting there, being there, marching, getting your church there, that is critical. Number two, even though it looks like we see bad decision after bad decision, there are potentially two states in which, before the Supreme Court rules, we could get a victory in a statewide vote on traditional marriage. Those two states are Ohio and Indiana. And everyone on this call has heard time and time again that the media saying, well, the people of this country now support same-sex marriage. The people of this country now support same-sex marriage. It's interesting to note that in both of these states, the state group is trying to push to put same-sex marriage on the ballot. But the same national groups who claim that there's overwhelming support for same-sex marriage in this country, in Ohio, are trying to stop a vote taking place. The most recent polling shows Ohio, and again, one important point about the polling is that if you take all of the polls in states where we've had marriage amendment votes, you take the polls that occurred in the month before, they understate support for traditional marriage by about 6.5 points. That's very important because the polling, time and time again, has understated what people actually do in the ballot box. So in Ohio, there is an opportunity for supporters of traditional marriage to push back on the court and for there to be a vote defending traditional marriage. We won't know whether the other side's going to move forward until June in Ohio. In Oregon, which is going to be a much tougher state, and many folks, especially inside the Beltway, there's a view that there's no way that supporters of traditional marriage can win in Oregon, although in 1996 we did, that the most recent polling shows support for redefining marriage, and again, this is done by folks on the other side of the issue, still shows it at around 54-55%. So as a means of comparison, in California, the public polling at times before Proposition 8 showed support for redefining marriage all the way up to 58% or more. So it is not as though it's impossible that a win couldn't occur at the state level in Oregon, and we're working closely with the Catholic Church and other churches there in Oregon to have a strong campaign. So anything that folks can do, if you're in either of those states, those are going to be critical states. Third, there are efforts in Congress to protect marriage in a number of different ways. Number one is the State Marriage Defense Act, which would stop what Holder is doing and the DOJ is doing in saying that if you got a same-sex marriage in Massachusetts, move to Alabama, Alabama's got to recognize your same-sex marriage. That's the way the federal government is essentially operating. It's saying that if you move, the federal government would still recognize your same-sex marriage regardless of where you move to. This bill would defend the state's laws and say, well, if you move into a state and the state defines marriage as the union of a man and a woman, that's the law of the land. And Senators Cruz and Lee have moved that in the Senate, and Congressman Weber has moved that in the House. So we want to get a vote on this. And again, it is not as though there's a high likelihood of getting this out of the Senate, but we could get a vote in the House, and pressure has to be brought to bear on leadership to push for a vote. There's also a bill that Raul Labrador is supporting that would protect 501c3 organizations, churches, nonprofits from being discriminated against because they support traditional marriage. That is a key bill. We support it. We were involved very early on in both the drafting and trying to move that forward through Congress. And finally, there will be a bill that protects adoption agencies, child welfare providers from having happen what has happened in states like Illinois and Massachusetts and other states where adoption providers are being targeted by the state because they will only place children with traditional married couples. The state is yanking their adoption licenses. This federal bill would essentially say if the state does that, they're going to lose federal funding, and that bill will be coming out in the next month. That will be introduced. So there are three bills there moving forward in Congress. Another important bill is the Tim Huelscamp's constitutional amendment defining marriage as the union of a man and a woman. I think we're up to about 68 sponsors. It should be a lot more. Pressure has to be brought to bear on congressmen. People need to be encouraged to co-sign on this bill. Again, immediately, is that bill going to move forward? No. But the more co-sponsors that are gained on that bill, the more support it gets. That highlights something to the court about where the people of this country stand. On what happened today and yesterday with Holder, there was a press conference today with the Coalition of African American Pastors. Actually, a number of black pastors stood up in D.C. at the National Press Club and called for Holder's impeachment. That's a fourth thing. There are a lot of different efforts going on right now to highlight how extreme and lawless both our attorney generals are being and the Department of Justice is being. There are opportunities to sign on to these efforts. I would encourage everyone to do that. So those are four very concrete things. All it takes is contacting your representatives, showing up at events, signing on to these efforts and letters. These are easy things that you can do. The final thing that's getting a lot of press are these religious liberty state fights that are going on. One's going on, obviously, right now in Arizona. What's happening is that the press is falsely and blatantly mischaracterizing these bills as somehow rights to discriminate against gays.
Even on Fox, Brian, even on Fox, they're doing the same thing.
Right. That is not what these bills do at all. What these bills do is states like Arizona already have RFRAs, or Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, on a state level. If you go back, the Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act with overwhelming support in '96 and the signature of Bill Clinton, protecting religious believers and institutions from having their religious beliefs trampled on. The Supreme Court said, well, yeah, you can do that on a federal level, but the federal government can't force states to do that. And therefore, when the Supreme Court issued that decision, a number of states passed Religious Freedom Restoration Acts on a state level. Arizona was one. What the bill in Arizona does is not give you a license to discriminate. What it does is it says that we have to take very seriously the First Amendment right to religious liberty, and that you cannot coerce individuals or businesses, not just on marriage, but on, for example, the HHS mandate, to go against their sincerely held religious convictions and, for example, pay for people's abortions or take part in a same-sex marriage ceremony. The bakers that have been targeted, the Elaine photography case is a key reason for this sort of legislation, where you have a photographer who is sued by the state of New Mexico, actually sued by a private party in New Mexico, and the state Supreme Court says, well, hey, leaving your religious beliefs at the door of your business is a part of, quote, the price of citizenship. These bills protect what is already clearly a part of our law, and that is religious liberty. They expand it to make sure that same-sex marriage or other attacks on religious liberty aren't used to coerce individuals, especially in their private businesses, to go against their conscience on what marriage is by their acts, whether it's being forced to photograph a ceremony that you don't agree with, forced to create a same-sex marriage wedding cake, whatever it is. That's a very different thing than saying that this is somehow Jim Crow all over again. In fact, it's the reverse. What proponents of same-sex marriage are attempting to do is to coerce Americans to leave their faith at the door when they enter the public square, leave their faith at the door if they own a business. And the Arizona bill makes very clear, which, by the way, was intended in the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that protection also extends not only to the individual or to a church, but also when an individual opens a business, that the protections are still there for for-profit corporations, so that what happened in the Elaine photography case will not happen again. And that case is working its way up to the Supreme Court.
Okay.
So that's my brief update. I'd love to take questions.
All right, Brian, thank you very much. Folks, don't forget, press *6 to get in queue for questions. *6 to get in queue for questions. Brian, let me ask the first one. I have to tell you, I was deeply disturbed today when I saw the discussion on Fox, and I saw the conservative representative agreeing with Juan Williams and the moderator, Martha McCallum, who I like and really think of Martha McCallum as being fairly conservative based on what I'd heard, talking about this issue as if Christians are just a bunch of stumble-bum haters and bigots, and where would they come up with a crazy law like this? Even Martha McCallum used the phrase. She said, well, what gay wants to go get a hate cake anyway? A hate cake. So if you're a bakery and you're Christians and you don't believe in same-sex marriage and you don't want to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding, you're a hate bakery. I mean, so how do we as believers address this kind of smear on our character? Well, we're required to love people, and we do, but how do you approach this in a way that diffuses this characterization, even by people who we would think would be our allies, this characterization of us as bigots and haters?
Well, I think, number one, folks need to actually look at the talking points Alliance Defense Fund has on the bill itself so that we are on solid, fact-based ground. The other side is not basing its arguments at all on fact. I wonder if they've even read the bill, because what they're doing is taking a New York Times meme and then regurgitating it time and time again. And I'm not surprised that Fox does this. I'll tell you, Fox is one of the most difficult places at times for NOM and other conservative groups to get on, because many folks at Fox don't want to touch any debate on same-sex marriage or quote-unquote gay issues. They just want to sort of run from them. So it doesn't surprise me, but if you familiarize yourself with just the talking points on the bill, you'll see that these folks some of them lawyers, aren't even paying attention to the current state of constitutional law on religious liberty. Look, anyone needs to look back at what was litigated under the Amish in the Yoder case. And for example, the Amish did not want to send their kids to mandatory public schools. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, indeed, that this is the law in Wisconsin, that you have to send your kids to public schools. This is mandatory, but that religious liberty trumps this state law. So we already have a respect in our law for religious liberty, given that that is a First Amendment, one of our first liberties laid out in the Constitution, that the government already recognizes. So to say that somehow this is new, this is going against existing constitutional law, that is just not correct. And I think being willing to call a spade, trying to get on these, any of us in a position to get on these stations, know our facts, and go on there and make the arguments that win with the public. There was just a poll in Kansas. There's been one in Arizona. When people know what this law is about, you've got 80% support in these states for protecting the religious liberty of folks who don't agree with same-sex marriage. This is a winning issue for us. What we need to point to are the specific examples. I brought up the photography example. Americans do not believe that a photographer in her business should be targeted by same-sex couples, because we all know that is what happened here. There were other photographers that the same-sex couples could go to. They chose to go to a Christian photographer and then have that photographer compelled to use her artistic skills to take part in that celebration. Americans know that is wrong. So when they bring up discrimination, we need to turn it on its head and say, this is about anti-religious, specifically in some cases anti-Christian religious bigotry, and there's no place for this in this country. The discrimination is there, but right now what's happening is the discrimination is coming from those that want to punish, repress, and marginalize individuals and organizations who stand up for their religious beliefs. And what they're trying to do is to constrain religious liberty to a new term, freedom of worship. Well, our founders didn't die and come here for freedom of worship. They came for religious liberty, to practice in the public square, not only within their houses of worship what they believe, but to go out into the community and to be able to act on it. And this is one of the important points when we debate this, is to not accept this new language of quote-unquote freedom of worship. We believe in religious liberty. We believe in freedom of conscience. We don't accept the idea that people should be punished in the public square for trying to live out the gospel call.
Right. Keep it in your church and within the four walls of your church, and you're fine. But don't bring it out into the public. We don't want to hear it. I mean, that's the message. Before we go to the next call, and folks, press *6. We're going to take just a couple more calls. We ask you to keep your question brief, and Brian, if you could keep the answers brief, because we're getting short on time.
Okay.
But tell us, please. You mentioned the Alliance. It's now called the Alliance for Freedom, I believe, correct?
Alliance Defending Freedom.
Alliance Defending Freedom, okay. How would people go about getting those talking points? Do you know?
Go to alliancedefendingfreedom.org, and it's right there on their homepage.
Excellent. And what about contacting you?
B. Brown at nationformarriage.org, all spelled out. You can contact me.
D. Brown at nationformarriage.org.
Correct.
Okay.